Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining the Canadian Association of Government Finance Officers, our weekly Wednesday webinar. I have to be careful how I say that. We're thrilled today to be joined by Tim Duhamel, the president of Bloom Centre for Municipal Education, and his guest presenter, Wayne Roth, who is a councillor with the beautiful city of Spruce Grove in lovely Alberta. I think it's important to note that Tim is one of the chosen few. He is from the ranks of government finance, having worked for many years in senior roles, and decided he could use those talents as an educator moving forward. So today we're thrilled to have Tim and Wayne join us to discuss crisis leadership, which seems to be exceptionally timely. So thank you both for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Lee. I'm really happy to be here with everybody today. I started doing this about 2 years ago, and one of the key things, and Lee kind of alluded to, is I'm a municipal professional just like many of you. I spent 20 years in the business as a finance manager, as a chief administrative officer, as a CAO. I was a general manager of community protective services for the city of Spruce Grove, in charge of RCMP and recreation and things like that, and really have enjoyed my experience as a municipal veteran. And during that time, over 20 years, I spent a lot of time observing and being involved in crisis. In municipalities, it's something that we're pretty used to. There's not really any kind of a season that you don't see some kind of a crisis in a municipality of some type, whether it be a flood, a fire, again, crime, whatever it might be. So it's something that we're fairly used to. Again, I'm really happy to be here. And you know what? And I really want to thank Wayne Roth for joining me. And one of the things I thought was really important about this webinar today was providing you with some thoughts around crisis leadership, from what's required for a finance officer, what's required for messaging, but also to get the feedback from an elected official who is a veteran of well over 20 years in municipal government, but also to say, well, what is it the elected officials are expecting from us as finance officers as well? Because again, there's so much expectation right now in relationship to messaging and getting things out to the public in a really good way. Wayne, do you have anything to add before I begin the presentation?
No, Tim, I don't think that's a pretty good introduction. I agree that from time to time we do have relatively minor crises compared to the one that we're currently in, and I think that we need to be prepared. And I think one of the takeaways from this is for the CAOs and finance officials to go back to their offices when this is all done and come up with plans to deal with a crisis of this magnitude, because it may not be the last one that we see.
That is so true. It is so true. You know, one of the things as well, and just before, as a segue, before I get going, is we have to realize that there are some municipalities that are now dealing with multiple crises. We're getting into flood and fire season. City of Fort McMurray here in Alberta is dealing with a flood, a significant flood right now, as well as the pandemic. And so it's compounding. And so really it's about kind of understanding crisis. How do we react in crisis? And what's that financial impact? And how do we act as financial leaders? What's important? And so I'm going to get right into it. I'm going to turn the cameras off for everybody. We have an hour to get through a lot of material today, and hopefully enjoy it. So we've got our bios in here. Now, really about crisis leadership, what I'm going to talk about today is really we're going to define what crisis is, so you have a good understanding of the definition of crisis. I'm going to talk about the municipal leadership role. We're going to talk about crisis messaging, and then I'm going to go over a little bit about a cash flow model. And one of the things, just for awareness, when I started putting the material together, I realized there was a lot of material related to the cash flow model. So what I've talked to Anne from CAGFO this morning, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to provide a supplemental after the webinar. I'm going to do a little bit more work, create a half-hour video, and that will be sent to all the registrants with the model probably about tomorrow morning. So you're not missing out on anything, but I thought to get through all the material, I wanted to be very, very cognizant of time today. So when we're looking at the takeaways of today's webinar, really it's about crisis leadership and understanding what our role is as financial officers. What's expected of us? What behaviors do we have to exhibit, and what do we have to really kind of look at doing at the beginning of a crisis, during the middle of a crisis, during the time we're coming out of a crisis. What are the key stages and what's expected of us as financial officers? A key part of that, obviously, is crisis messaging. And I'm sure right now, most of you are feeling some pressure in relationship to messaging around this current crisis. There is so much information coming at us and also changing pretty much daily. We are expected to be able to interpret the crisis in financial terms. And I think it's a really key point in relationship to what our expectations are of us as financial officers and our role in the municipality as leaders. We have to really grasp a hold of that role and essentially lead from behind for the whole organization from a financial perspective. And then again, I'm going to talk about the cash flow model a little bit today, and again, be providing you a supplemental that will provide a lot of value tomorrow. So, crisis defined. What is a crisis? A crisis essentially is a specific and unexpected and non-routine event. It will threaten an organization's high priority goals. So it's something that, again, is something that isn't typical. It's something that's unexpected. It's not something that happens annually, but can happen, again, unexpectedly. And we have to be ready to basically react quickly in a way where we can make decisions. Another way of looking at it is a conditional of instability or danger. It's an abnormal or unstable situation that threatens our strategic objectives. Again, as municipalities, we all have strategic plans, we all have goals, we all have objectives that we're trying to achieve. A crisis certainly can get in the way of those strategic goals. And again, one of the key things to note about crisis, it's a low probability but high impact event. So as we start thinking about risk management and understanding crisis, all municipalities at some point are going to probably be affected in some way, shape, or form by crisis. And it can be, again, forest fire, flood, infrastructure failure. The list is endless when it comes down to municipal threats in relationship to crisis. And we have to understand that what it really means is that decisions may need to be made swiftly. Now, as financial officers, that's challenging for us because one of the things that we're used to is making sure that we can take the time to be accurate, to make sure that we're correct in our analysis, that things are prudent and well thought out. And so the crisis in some ways can challenge the financial officer in some ways a lot more than our counterparts, say in community protective services that are in charge of fire and ambulance and they're used to reacting very quickly, or operations that are used to challenges from an operations perspective, whether it be snow or again, issues with grass cutting cycles, whatever it might be. They're a little bit more tuned to crisis reaction than we are in finance. And so that's a really big part of our understanding in terms of understanding ourselves and how we have to react to the crisis itself. One of the things that's really important about understanding crisis from that finance perspective is that the event itself is essentially the event crisis. So for example, right now, we're dealing with COVID-19. Could be a forest fire, could be a flood. Those are the things that are essentially tied to, again, the root cause of the overall crisis. But the key thing from a finance perspective, and really organizationally, is that it's going to create situations. And often from a finance perspective, it's more the situational crisis that we need to be concerned with more so than the root cause itself. So for example, COVID-19 is causing issues from a tax fee and utility payment loss and or deferral challenges, which is being asked for in many cases in municipalities. We have service delivery changes and cancellations. Again, there's a financial impact to that. Working remotely from a staff perspective, policing and bylaw challenges. I heard just lately in Edmonton, they're talking about, or they did find people who were walking together that weren't in the same household. So obviously new bylaw changes have been emerging in relationship to understanding how to combat this crisis that we're facing. Project cancellations, facility closures, it goes on and on and on. But one of the key things as financial officers we have to understand in crisis is to not look directly at the event itself, but understand the situation and then be able to eventually interpret that from a financial perspective. And so one of the key parts of messaging that we'll get to later is as we start to lead as financial officers, we need to be prudent and be disciplined in understanding we have to look at what are the impacts and basically the ripple effects of the actual event. What are the situations that are going to occur from the crisis itself that are going to need to be dealt with from a financial perspective and interpreted financially for, again, our councils, our public, and obviously our executive teams. So when we're looking at crisis, we have to understand there's essentially 6 key stages. We're going to have the warning of a crisis. Again, COVID-19, obviously in January, February, we started hearing things coming out of China about the concerns of a virus that was very contagious and very dangerous. We're going to have the stage of risk assessment. So again, really important for the financial officer, the risk assessment, understanding what kind of impacts are we going to have to face as a municipality from the risk assessment related to the crisis itself. So we're basically in charge of providing key information, evidence, solutions, business continuity, whatever it might be. We have to look at the risk itself and start to interpret that from a financial perspective for our municipalities. And then we have to start thinking about the crisis and development of a response. And so again, from a financial perspective, we might be looking at deferral of tax payments, or how are we going to make sure the bills get paid? So looking at our payables group, how are we going to make sure that we have cash flow coming in? How are we going to be looking at how do we resource our staff from a remote perspective? How do we continue the business continuity and response from a finance perspective? And one of the key things, and again, I'm going to ask Wayne to speak to this in a second, part of our response has to be messaging to council. How is it we're going to respond, and after we've assessed the risk, respond to council in relationship to, here, council, is the situation. We know we have all of these challenges from a pandemic perspective, but what does that mean financially? And Wayne, maybe you have some thoughts on this, but what would your expectations be from your finance department in providing an appropriate response for council to use?
Well, I think you've alluded to it, Tim, but I think it can't be stressed enough that we do need to look at this from the point of view of residents. I think pretty much everybody on this call will be in a very fortunate position that we have job and income security, but not everybody is as fortunate who lives in our community. So we have to think about this in terms of the financial impact it'll have on our residents, on our citizens, on our ratepayers. A lot of them are financially stressed, and some very severely financially stressed. You know, you lose 2 incomes, you're stuck at home with a spouse and 2 or 3 children, and that can be very stressful. But that's why I think it's important to, for example, in Spruce Grove, we have allowed a deferral, not a forgiveness, but a deferral on taxes and utilities, and those kinds of strategies have to be planned for.
Really key points, and I think what Wayne's alluding to there, and again, important for the financial officer to understand, is we have to think through to the end. As we're starting to develop our response to crisis and then ultimately our messaging, we have to think of the end result. And obviously, and again, Wayne pointed out, the elected officials' perspective is, what are the residents going to think? And so again, as we start to plan for, again, things like revenue deferral and or understand we're going to have issues from a cash flow perspective as we close down facilities or services, how do we message that and be somewhat empathetic to the end user, who again, obviously are our residents? Once we have that done, we have to think about the management stage. Obviously, as finance, we're going to have things like, again, we have to keep the lights on. We have to make sure that vendors are paid, that our staff are paid. We have to make sure that we're collecting money. We have to make sure, again, from a business continuity perspective, finance is well managed and maintained. We have to understand that as a key stage. We're then going to run into the resolution stage, and then obviously the recovery stage. And again, when we're looking at a pandemic, this is something that we're not used to, something we haven't seen before. But you know, my experience from other types of crisis, whether it be fire, whether it be flood, obviously the finance function, and what we're going to have to understand is thinking about that resourcing to do our cost analysis of crisis. What's the cost? What's the long-term financial impact from a sustainability perspective? What do we have to do from an insurance perspective? There's going to be a lot that we have to think about, but we have to understand, again, there's going to be 6 stages, and we have to understand what is our response going to be as financial officers to, again, tie ourselves to that leadership model of leadership crisis, being able to provide great information to our CAO, our council, and ultimately the public in terms of how we're going to respond and be able to, again, keep the municipality running in a proper way. So when we're thinking about the definition of a crisis, we have to understand this is a really good grid to really look at from a municipal perspective. The crisis itself is going to be related to the incident, and the incident typically is related to safety and or security. Again, COVID-19 obviously is a safety risk, but it's also a security risk in that we have to worry about, we have all kinds of businesses that are closed down, that are open to theft, open to vandalism, whatever it might be. We have to think about these things from a safety and risk perspective in terms of the whole service delivery model that we're providing to residents on a daily basis. So that will end up being kind of, again, issue based. So very much like the event versus situational crisis, we're going to start thinking about the issues from that financial perspective. So again, the root cause of the crisis is, say, the pandemic. But what we need to think about from a financial perspective is really, how does that affect our performance in the service delivery that we're providing to residents on a daily basis? How is it going to affect us from a policy perspective in terms of what's expected of us? And then ultimately, what is the financial impact of what is going to happen from, again, the crisis itself? And then again, we're going to start looking at solutions subsequent to that. So this part of the presentation was really to help you understand the definition of crisis. And it's a critical piece about crisis leadership, is really at the outset, not reacting quickly necessarily. Now, obviously, there are some things that we have to react to fairly quickly, but we have to understand the crisis itself. We have to define it. And then again, as financial officers, really have a good feel for what are the implications of the crisis? What's the situational crisis that's going to become the ripple effect of the root cause of the crisis? That is where finance, again, professionals and leaders have to shine in times of crisis, is really having that understanding of impact and being able to provide good evidence and decision-making material for our councils and our executive teams. So the municipal finance role, as I just said, one of the key things about crisis leadership, and when I read this book, and this is a really great book, I would recommend it for anybody, is Crisis Leadership by Tim Johnson. Read it over the last couple of weeks, really enjoyed it. One of the key things that really hit me is that the ability of leaders in crisis is not to show different leadership competencies, but the same competencies that they show when there isn't a crisis. So again, we're going to be looking at uncertainty, high levels of emotion, the need to make swift decisions, and we're going to be under, and this is a really key piece of this, intolerable external scrutiny. So we're going to be under a lot of pressure. So when we reflect on that, we have to think as financial officers, what does that mean to us? What are the characteristics that we typically show as leaders? Financial leader attributes. What is it as financial officers is expected of us on a daily basis? And then we want to carry those same attributes onto our crisis leadership model as well. Obviously, we communicate well. We're transparent in the way we present information to council and the public. We obviously, as leaders, we're accurate and we enumerate. And I have to say, I worked for an individual who was the president of the Alberta GFO for many years. He was my mentor, CFO of Strathcona County. His name is George Hybrick. And when I started my career, I was always in awe a little bit of how he could go in front of council and you could feel the trust that had been kind of, built up over the years. And when he said things to council, they really listened and they showed a lot of respect for him. But what I realized over time, it's because he had years of time spent of being transparent with council, being accurate with the information he brought forward, being seen as honest, timely, and he would give them the bad news as well as the good. He was never scared of going in front of council, though sometimes they didn't like it, but telling them kind of really how it is. And it really made me understand about what's expected of us as financial leaders, as financial officers, what we need to do. So when we're thinking about, again, the crisis, we want to make sure the characteristics that we typically show are the same ones that we show in crisis: financial stewardship, timeliness, and vision and forward looking. And again, I'm going to just turn over to Wayne here for a moment and say, Wayne, I mean, you spent a lot of time, and as you know, somebody who was very dear to my heart, Glenn Gerbeau, who was the CFO at Spruce Grove, I noticed the same attributes. So how did you feel when he presented financial information in both good times and crisis, Wayne?
Well, similar to you at Strathcona County, Tim, we've been very fortunate over the years to have CAOs and financial professionals and other senior staff members who have been very trustworthy. And you made a good point that I would like to stress, in that council members want accurate information. We want to hear what we need to hear, even if it isn't what we want to hear. For example, or what I'm saying is, tell us the bad news if the news is bad. It's not good to keep anything from us, because it will hurt all of us in the long run. So be very honest and tell us what we need to hear.
Yeah, you know, I've presented many times in front of councils. Wayne has seen me do it, and I've walked out of the council chambers and felt pretty kind of beat up a bit sometimes because I was the deliverer of bad news. But one of my mentors told me a long time ago, he said, you know what, they're not going to like it when you give them the bad news, and they may beat you up, but they'll beat you up worse if you don't give it to them, and it blows up in their face later. So it's really important, again, that in terms of crisis, we have to just tell it like it is. And so again, I think the key point is that as financial leaders, we have to understand what is typically expected of us from a leadership perspective. And then remember, as the crisis begins and the emotions begin to take hold and we start to panic in some cases and the information is coming so quick, we want to fall back to our leadership attributes and understand what is expected of us as financial leaders, and know that our councils, our executive CAOs, and ultimately our public are depending on us to continue with those same attributes as we go forward through crisis as we do during regular and I guess more conventional times. So when we're thinking about the leadership perspective and we're thinking about when the crisis happens, we want to think about two key things: time and space. Really important. Time is essentially understanding that as we look at the crisis, we're going to have to figure out, one, we need to buy time to be able to understand what the crisis really means, get our messaging correct, and then develop our solutions and how we're going to manage the crisis itself. But we want to make sure that we look at the crisis and understand, is this going to be a long-term crisis? Is it a short-term crisis? And we want to get into kind of what's called the battle rhythm. Understand that if this is a long-term crisis, we as leaders have to exude that and make sure that we are, again, working with our department staff, working again with our executive and our councils, and understand if this isn't going to be short-term, we need to have some pace. We're going to have some longevity in the way that we react to the crisis itself. So again, understanding as we move forward with again, a crisis leadership model, we want to pay attention to the time and understand and analyze the crisis itself in terms of what's going to be expected. Second part is really space, and this is a really important part from a finance perspective. And pace is essentially creating and using cognitive space to consider what options are available to them. And again, as I read this in the book, what really hit me is what this meant from a finance perspective is essentially space is knowledge. Space is evidence. Space is time. Or not time, but space is really providing that analytical piece to really interpret the crisis from a financial perspective and develop solutions. And so when we're thinking about the leadership model, we want to buy ourselves time so we can react well to the crisis itself, but then we also need knowledge. We need to have the facts. We need to understand what the crisis really means. What are the solutions that are ahead of us? What should we do and what shouldn't we do? So in a sense, when you combine these two, it really sets us up for success long-term. And I can't stress this enough. The finance role, when it comes down to crisis, I would say we are probably one of the most important parts of space, because for our CAOs, for our elected officials, they really need good information so that they can make good decisions. It's really about evidence-based decision making. So when we're thinking about, again, that crisis leadership model, it comes down to really having two things: the appropriate resources to lean upon. So we have to look at the crisis and understand, as financial officers, what are our financial resources? What human resources can we lean on? What's our technology ability? What's our knowledge? And what's the timely and accurate information that we have that we can lean upon? And again, I can't stress enough, as financial officers, timely and accurate information is key from our perspective as our role in terms of the crisis leadership team. Then we need to have skilled colleagues to support the leader. Again, essentially, when you have a crisis, if you don't have anybody to lead, there's no leadership. And this is really, again, where municipal financial professionals have to shine. We have to understand we're essentially leading from the back. And so when it comes to crisis and decisions get made, and whether it's decisions around deferring taxes because of the COVID-19 or delaying utility bill payments, or maybe laying staff off, which is a very difficult decision, or closing down non-essential services, there's going to be a requirement to understand what that means financially. So again, without that information, a leader, again, ultimately your chief elected official and your chief administrative officer may make significant mistakes if they do not understand the leadership perspective from the finance perspective. So we really need to be able to prepare and provide our take on the crisis and have that understanding in relationship to providing good information. So we are really, in a sense, supporting the leader by leading from the back. So really, when we're looking at this, and again, a typical municipality, the way they're set up is we have our mayor and council, so we have our elected officials, we have our chief administrative officer, and we have essentially four streams. General manager of corporate services, general manager of community protective services, that's what I was in the city of Spruce Grove, and the general manager of planning and engineering. Part of this leadership level is also finance, so the CFO division. But when it comes to crisis, the CFO role will often move off to the side as a feeder of information from a leadership perspective to the rest of these areas. So the CFO expectations in terms of crisis activity is going to be conducting analysis, providing good stewardship. So you want to make sure that your residents and your council still feels that we're strong from a financial perspective, that where things are being taken care of. We have to provide timely information and provide great facts for decision making. We have to be able to interpret the policy implications. Often we have policy related to crisis, and when issues happen, we have to follow those policies regardless of the situation. And so a big part of our job from a leadership and messaging perspective is to understand and interpret financial policy and what the crisis means for, again, our external leaders. We want to be able to implement, again, our business continuity. A big part of the finance leadership role is going to be, again, making sure that the bills are getting paid, that we're bringing in money. We can still work as an organization. Things can still function. Again, I was involved in the business continuity exercise many years ago when I was working at Strathcona County. And one of the key things, and it was surprising me at the time because I really didn't know a lot about business continuity. This was in the early 2000s. We had a consultant come in, and one of the key things that they put on the board was that one of the most important pieces of business continuity in times of crisis, in times of emergency, is the finance function. Because one, we have to have budget. We have to understand what financial implications, what kind of resources we need. We need to understand what impact it's going to have financially in terms of our long-term financial sustainability. We have to understand what resources we have. Do we have reserves in place? Do we have an ability to react? And then obviously we have to be able to advocate to other levels of government for need, whether it might be additional debt capacity or changes in the way that we look at deficits. The finance role is critical from that leadership perspective. And so when we're looking at that, we understand here's the key issues and activity that we're going to be able to provide in that crisis time. One of the key things, and I put this in bold, that we often misunderstand, and I learned this over many years as a financial officer, is we have to be good at the messaging. It's great when we're great analysts, and this is what we're really good at. We're great at crunching numbers. We're great at policy. We're great at, again, being very organized and those types of things. But sometimes as financial officers, what we fall down on is the good messaging. And so being able to interpret that financial message in ways that our council and our public can understand well. And I can't stress enough, you can be the best accountant in the world, you can be the best CFO in the world, but if you can't get your message out in a way that your residents can understand, the way your council can understand, you're really not providing, again, that full value that is required from a leadership perspective for finance. And again, I watched my CFO at Strathcona County do this massively, and I watched, again, Glenn Trabeau do this in Spruce Grove. And again, maybe Wayne could comment to this, but I think the key thing is that we have to understand who our reader is or who our viewer is and make sure our messaging is clear. Wayne, do you have any thoughts on this in terms of clarity of messaging from finance?
Well, we all have communication staff, and those departments are the experts in how to get messaging across. But I think it's key that we need to, I think regular updates need to be provided to council because we get lots and lots of questions. And the number one question, I think, will be the impact on people's taxes. So it's good to have updates that include, for example, staff safety, how essential services are being maintained, fire and ambulance and policing, but people tend not to be too concerned about ambulance, for example, until they actually need it. But their taxes are going to be affected, and people will need to know about that. And I think that's where financial officers come in.
Especially in a time when we're so strained financially in so many other ways. For many of us, the bills are piling up. Whether it be, again, utility bills, whether it be, anything that we're doing, our mortgages, and now we have this tax thing that's going to be coming up for municipalities. So I think it's a really great point, Wayne, is just really understanding and empathizing with our end user and using messaging in a way that can be interpreted and understand the view of the residents. As we move forward, again, further understanding the financial role in relationship to, again, a crisis, we have to understand one of the key things is we are still the financial steward. And that means we're going to be involved in business continuity. We have to really look at good reserve planning, financial impact forecasting, what if scenarios, budget adjustments, communication for the executive team, we have to figure out what is our key role in terms of crisis. And I'm going to get into this much more when I get into the messaging, but one of the key things, again, when a crisis happens, typically, what my observation was is when you're assembling your crisis team, one of the first questions that's going to come up is, how do we pay the bills? Do we have enough money to be able to handle the crisis? Your CAO and your elected officials are certainly going to ask that. So one of the first things you're going to want to do as a financial officer is understand your financial position. What is it? Where is it we stand today in terms of our ability to be able to take on a crisis from a liquidity perspective? And then we have to start looking at that forecasting. And so when we're looking at really what our role is going to be from a leadership perspective, we want to be able to analyze and assess the situation in financial terms. Again, looking at those situational events and crises that we're going to have to deal with. We want to make sure that we can develop the evidence for decision making, create scenarios and financially sustainable solutions, and then finally lead finance related communication. And so those are the 4 key aspects of leadership that we have to understand from a crisis perspective as financial officers. And I can't stress enough, there are really kind of components of this. One, again, understanding financial position, being in a position to be able to analyze and be able to provide evidence-based decision making, and really do what if scenario and come up with solutions, because again, we're going to need them. And again, in Alberta here, we've seen some significant crisis over the last number of years. Forest fire and flood has become a very big part of our, again, annual concerns as, again, obviously municipalities within our province. It's probably like that across Canada, but again, we've seen significant flooding in Calgary, significant forest fires up north where we've had towns that have been significantly affected, and obviously the pandemic's a big one. And it really is important to understand that we have a really critical role in combating those crises from a financial perspective. And so knowing what is expected of us, knowing what pieces of information that we have to start putting together, you really kind of want to have your checklist in a sense for being able to provide and develop your role. When we're thinking about the preparatory steps as a crisis leader, one of the things that really hit me about this that I thought was really important for the financial officer is challenging optimism. And really what that means is our own. Whenever a crisis happens, the first thing we often think of is, well, the sky's falling. I mean, we'll never get through this. This is going to be really challenging. As financial officers, we're very conservative. So we're always going to go usually to the worst case scenario, as we should, for providing evidence and, again, decision-making information. But during a crisis, we also have to challenge ourselves and think that, well, there's going to be a way through it. We have to challenge ourselves in terms of optimism. And as a leader, whether we're comfortable with it or not, we're going to have to show that and display that to our staff, to the rest of the organization. Because again, how's the organization going to feel if the chief financial officer or the leader of finance is panicking or saying, well, I don't think we can get through this, or there's going to be issues? That is really going to cause great issues from a crisis leadership perspective within the organization. So one of the key things we have to understand at the beginning is we have to challenge ourselves and become a little bit more optimistic about what's going to happen. We want to cultivate a crisis-ready culture. So this is really about preparing your staff, talking with them. Again, when the crisis begins, you might want to bring your staff together and talk about, hey, we're in a tough time, but we can get through this. We want to be ready for kind of what comes ahead. We know that there's going to be some tough times. There's going to be overtime. There's going to be challenges working together, whatever it might be. We want to make sure that we cultivate a crisis-ready culture. And then finally, we want to prepare the organization to respond quickly. And again, I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but one of the key things is we want to understand what is our response going to be as we start looking at basically being financial officers. How is it we're going to actually react well to the crisis itself? So when we're thinking about kind of crisis leadership and the steps that we have to go through, this is basically the list of the things that we need to think about. One, pause and reflect. When you get bad news, don't react a split second later. Again, crises are going to happen. It's happened often. I mean, you can look at history. They happen every year in municipalities for sure. It's really key to show poise at the beginning. And there is a really controversial example of this, but it's George Bush. Was the president of the United States, and 9/11 happened. He was actually reading to a kindergarten class in elementary. He was reading a book, and a Secret Service agent came in and whispered in his ear that, again, a plane had hit one of the Trade Center towers. George Bush turned and he actually finished the story calmly, closed the book, and then walked out calmly. And what was noted about that from a leadership perspective, and it's very much debated today, is that what he wanted to show and what he consciously thought of was showing poise, because he recognized he was on national TV. And what would it look like if the president jumped up and panicked? And so it's a controversial example, but it's one of those things that really kind of hits home about how we want to react, again, as financial officers. We do not want to look like we're panicking. You want to take the time to assess your situation. You want to, again, look at your policies, what analytical requirements are going to be required from you. You want to communicate well. So again, we want to be able to start developing our messaging, thinking about who is it we need to message to, CAO, counsel, the public. We want to start thinking about how we're going to craft that message. We certainly want to be visible. This is a really important part of leadership, and again, really key from a finance perspective. You want to calm your staff through visibility and accessibility. You want to be able to calm, again, your CAO and executive that, hey, the finance people are here, we're ready to do our part, and obviously the council. Again, an example of this, many years ago, British Petroleum, they had a very significant leak in the Gulf Coast. A week later, the chief executive of that company left. He actually said, I need a holiday. The stress is getting to me. A week after this significant issue happened. Well, how do you think the organization felt? How do you think the world reacted to that? Obviously, the leader of the organization had issues with, again, crisis and leadership. So we want to make sure that as we look at this information, we want to be visible and we want to stay calm. A big part of crisis leadership is assembling your team. In finance, this is important. We have numerous roles from a finance perspective. We have treasury, we have budget, we have reporting. We want to assemble our finance team because there's going to be moving parts to a crisis. Understanding how we're going to continue with our reporting so we have good timely information to understand the effect of the situation. We want to have our budget team assembled so that we can do good analytics to forecast out what challenges we're going to have. And obviously our treasury function. So again, payables, receivables, understanding where's our reserves at, like what can we do in relationship from a finance perspective, from a sustainability perspective, for managing any kind of a crisis. You want to look at holding department and stakeholder meetings. You're going to want to have input and feedback from others. You do not want to be basically an autocratic way of making decisions when it comes to finance and leadership. For crisis, you want to get other people's opinions. There are numerous examples of essentially disaster when it comes to crisis when somebody makes the decisions without getting feedback from others. And I can't stress enough, one of the key things that we have to understand as finance leaders, our role is to provide and arm our CAO, our council, and again, the elected officials essentially to have great information so that they can make really good decisions. And so we want to open up our communication within our departments and get everybody's feedback about how we're going to take on the crisis in any given time. And then finally, you want to deputize your key leaders. And again, obviously as finance, that's probably happened in your municipalities where you as finance leaders have been told you're going to be a key part of our crisis leadership team. We need your perspective, we need your understanding, and we really need, again, good information so that we can make great decisions going forward. So again, this is a nice list in relationship to the crisis leadership steps that you're going to have to go through as a leader. And I would really recommend after the webinar, take this one, throw it on your wall, because again, this isn't the only crisis that you'll go through in your career. I've seen many of them over my career, but you want to know that you're going through each of these steps and really playing your role again as that crisis leader. So again, real leaders are forged in crisis. And again, emotional intelligence is really, really important. So we want to be self-aware and basically conscious of our feelings. You have to be in charge of your emotions. So again, you do not want to show panic or get upset or show anger. Again, calmness, poise, prudent decision making. That's what's expected of us as financial leaders. So we want to really make sure that we're aware when a crisis begins. We're being self-aware. We're understanding how we're reacting. We have to have that self-control, fight or flight. We do not want to take flight, obviously, during a concern. Like I said, the British Petroleum example was a good one. We want to be socially aware. So again, crisis impacts business, people, systems. We want to have empathy. So we want to be aware, how is the crisis going to affect us organizationally? How does it affect staff in other departments? How is it affecting our executive? How is it affecting the residents? You want to be aware of those things as you begin to develop your solutions as a financial officer and leader. Again, can't stress this enough, and I think Wayne alluded to it very well from the elected official perspective to give us that perspective. If we do this without considering how the residents are going to think, we're going to get ourselves in a bit of trouble. We cannot be, how would I say it, unaware of people's feelings during this time. People are struggling financially. People are having difficulty socially. People are not seeing other people that they're used to seeing, friendships, whatever it might be. People are really struggling right now with this crisis. And so we do not want to be basically, again, for lack of a better word, cold or disconnected from people's feelings as we start to craft our messages and solutions from that financial perspective. And then finally, relationship management. As we go through crisis, again, when you're thinking about that battle rhythm and the time aspect of crisis, we're going to have to consider, how long is this crisis going to last? We want to understand that this may be for a long time, and so we have to take care of essentially our staff, our colleagues, ourselves. We have to manage relationships and essentially have friendliness with a purpose. Again, strong leadership, for lack of a better word, angry leadership can work in certain circumstances, usually very short circumstances, but it does not last over the long term. Time and time again, angry leadership has been shown to fail miserably when it comes down to any kind of issue, whether it be long-term and or crisis. It's not really the right way of actually looking at how we're going to manage and lead through a challenging time. And so when you're looking at this, again, you want to really be aware of emotional intelligence as you start to combat the crisis, again, as a financial officer. So with that, again, we've gone through quite a bit of material. I know it's a bit of a fire flow effect as a typical Bloom course. And again, you'll be getting all of these slides sent to you. So again, you have a bit of a guide. We're now going to get into messaging, because this is such a critical part of what we have to do as financial leaders. As we're dealing with this, one of the key things, and again, we alluded to this before, when dealing with situations of great adversity, you must retain faith that you will prevail. So again, that optimism that we have to have, but you must also confront the most brutal facts of your current reality. And that means being honest about the situation, not smoothing things over, understanding that this is going to be tough. And for municipalities right now, this is going to be very difficult from a financial perspective. We're looking at, municipalities are looking at additional debt, using debt for operations, which is very rare in municipal government. In fact, in most cases, it's actually not part of legislation. Looking at deficits, deficit budgeting. There's a lot of things that are being looked at right now that have not been looked at before, really, in terms of crisis, because again, this is such a challenging crisis. So we want to make sure that as leaders, when it comes to the messaging, that we start to craft the message in a very blunt, for lack of a better word, with, again, really paying attention to how we message things, but in a very honest and open and transparent way. So when we're thinking about the crisis leadership steps, and again, this is a different way of looking at it. This is, taking you through again to where you have to kind of deal with the crisis. One of the key parts is throwing that communication defense around the organization. Finance is a big part of that. So as we start looking at this, and again, I live in the Edmonton area. I think they've done a fantastic job, to be honest, of the way that they've handled things from a communication perspective. They have a very good and very vocal and communicative mayor. One of the things I've noticed is they're very good at communicating right now. They try and get information out as quickly as they can, as accurately as they can, and they're pivoting very well, which means that they've basically set themselves up to communicate quickly, accurately, in a timely fashion, and also back off when they realize something's changed. And again, not many of us saw that we'd be reopening business and reopening things as quickly as happening. And so the City of Edmonton, I've noticed in some of their communication, is pivoting to react to that. So we want to make sure that as part of our finance leadership model, we're looking at how are we going to start looking at our communication defense from a finance perspective for the organization. So again, one of the key things I think in our messaging we have to understand is crisis for municipality is not uncommon. We face it often, pretty much every year. We have crime, politics, litigation, infrastructure failure, and obviously the pandemic. And so one of the key parts of our messaging that we're going to put in our strategy is this isn't something that we haven't faced before. Now, I'm not saying the pandemic, but in terms of crisis, municipalities are typically pretty crisis ready in terms of business continuity and the way that we react from a leadership perspective. So when we're thinking about the messaging, we want to make sure that we're looking at 3 key drivers of good messaging. We want to make sure as financial officers in our messaging, we are grounded in facts, evidence, and quality analysis. So basically, we're showing the expertise in our messaging. We're not going to come up with things that are not basically trackable from basically a proof perspective. We're not going to have opinion. We're not going to, speculate. Our key part of our messaging is to really exude our expertise in terms of what we're doing for, again, our councils and ultimately our public. We want to be able to show empathy. And again, as Wayne alluded to before, empathy is a key piece to this. We want to make sure that our stakeholders, our councils, our elected officials, our residents, we're paying attention to them as we're coming forward with the messaging. So we may have bad news. We're going to have a significant deficit. We may be looking at long-term tax increases over the next 10 years to overcome the challenges that are faced from this pandemic. But we have to empathize with the current situation that our residents have. And so we want to be very careful with that messaging as we come out. We may be talking about that internally, that this is going to take years for us to overcome, and we're going to be looking at really, really tough financial decisions in the long term. But we want to be careful about who we message that to and how we message it to. We then want to look at timing. So timing is going to be a very important part of how we come up with things. We want to be able to react quickly with our timing, so it's timely in terms of our messaging, but we also want to make sure that we pause. And by pausing, we're making sure that our messaging is correct. We do not want to add to the crisis itself by coming out with some really bad messaging. And I don't want to beat them up too bad, but we have a certain leader to the south of a very big country that really causes a lot of issues and compounds the crisis, often because of sometimes incorrect messaging. And that's causing a lot of issue for the people who are really, in a sense, trying to manage and lead for the crisis and lead from that back end. And again, really important that from a finance perspective, we are very cognizant of pausing and making sure our messaging is correct. It deals with empathy and it really ties into the expertise that we're right in terms of what we're coming forward with. So when we're thinking about the messaging itself, we want to understand that essentially when we're crafting our message, we're going to have multiple stakeholders, but we have what I would call the big 3. Obviously, our message is going to have to tie to our administration. So we're going to be thinking about our CEO and executive, namely, and staff. We want to be able to provide facts, policy use, analytics, solutions, and financial impacts. Like one of the first things people are going to ask is, are we going to continue to be paid? How are we going to deal with essential services? How are we going to deal with layoffs if there are any? How do we deal with remote work balance? How are we going to deal with all these things? And all of them have a financial impact of some kind. So when we're crafting our message, we want to think about that administrative response. Obviously, council is a key stakeholder. We're going to want to think about our mayor, our council, and again, we're going to want to provide facts. How do we use policy? We want to, again, provide them with strong analysis and solutions. Develop and understand the financial impacts. Again, really key. That situational crisis that occurs is really the key thing as financial officers we want to pay attention to. We're not going to be expected to understand COVID-19 or a pandemic, but we're certainly going to be expected to understand what is the impact of the assessment loss related to this, or what's the impact of shutting down a recreation facility, or the impact of increased transit requirements, or whatever it might be. We need to be able to inform and make good, strong financial recommendations in times of crisis. And then ultimately, whenever we're talking to council, we always have to understand we're also talking to our public. And so finance is going to play a key role from a leadership perspective in that messaging. Though, as Wayne said, we may have communication specialists within our municipalities. We have to sit down with them and we have to make sure that we are getting facts to our council, to our public. We're educating them as to the situation from a financial perspective and what it may mean from a tax perspective. We want to craft our message. And one of the things that's really key and important during times of crisis, we still have to maintain transparency. So when we're thinking again about that messaging and how we're going to react to crisis, we certainly want to understand that we've got to think about our stakeholders as we craft our message and develop our strategy in 3 essential different ways. Obviously, our public also includes our business community, includes groups and stakeholders. We want to think about those too, because again, right now, business is probably one of the key and most hit stakeholders in our municipalities today with this pandemic. Again, we're talking about possibilities. You see all the stats in the papers. I'm not sure. Again, I'm not an expert in this, so I'm not sure which ones are accurate or not, but we hear things like 50% of business saying they don't know if they'll be able to come back from this. Well, that's horrifying from a municipal perspective, because again, our assessment levels, our taxes are very much based on, again, assessment from business. And so we have to understand, what is this going to mean from a perspective of challenge, from a resource perspective. So when we're thinking about this, again, in your messaging, you want to make sure you understand what we are. And as municipalities, I like to think of the municipal service equation. We are essentially there for one thing. We provide quality of life. And when we're looking at a crisis, the quality of life part of the equation is going to be affected in a pandemic by effects on our taxes, utility rates, and fees and charges, either through, again, deferral and or loss, and effects on our services. And so as we start crafting our message, though we're financial officers, we still want to be able to translate and understand that financial impact is in some way going to affect the end quality of life of our residents. An important piece to understand as we start developing our municipal communication strategy. When we're thinking about that, again, you want to pay attention and understand. You want to understand as a financial officer, how's it going to affect our departments? We have multiple departments, obviously, in municipalities, and they're all going to be affected in some way, shape, or form, service-wise, by the pandemic and or any other crisis. Our job as financial officers is to interpret what that means from a financial perspective. One, do we have reserves in place to help us combat certain types of crisis? Do we have contingency plans? Do we have business continuity plans? And do we have opportunity and or ways of looking at, say, tax deferral, and how's that going to impact things? So again, when we're thinking about our messaging, we want to understand in the background, we have to, as financial officers, interpret the effect that it's going to have on our departments. And again, as you can see here, financial services is one of the key supports to our external departments. So that's really going to tie to, again, providing our departments with the correct messaging so that they may be able to talk about the impacts themselves to, again, council and residents. So this is, again, a bit of an expansion of the last slide. I think this is a really good one to probably show to your councils. It's one that I would, when I used to present stuff, this is the kind of way I'd like to present something. When we look at the event crisis and whatever it might be in relationship to fire, flood, and pandemic, we have to understand the situational crisis. So again, union disputes, staff, remote work planning, assessment loss, whatever it might be, our job is to now translate that into the financial impact crisis. Because again, though the event crisis is really the root cause, we as municipalities are really going to be facing a financial impact crisis. So we're going to have issues with human resources, possibly additional overtime, contracting, consulting costs, operational issues, revenue loss, process changes, whatever it might be. We have to understand our role as financial leaders is going to be certainly developing the understanding of that impact. And so again, this is something I would throw up in front of a council, and maybe even in some way shape this so that we can have some kind of messaging going out to our residents, but they're going to have to understand that this is going to have a significant long-term impact on our municipality. And again, the event crisis may be the concern that everybody's thinking about, but we are going to have the challenges, municipal financial officers, of presenting the financial impact crisis in a messaging way that people can understand. So municipal finance, the message strategy, here are the steps that we're going to need to go through. One, identify your spokesperson, identify your scribe. It's really important to have somebody who's comfortable in terms of speaking in front of an audience, who's got business acumen, and really you want to also have somebody who's a good writer, somebody who can transfer the financial message into a way that people can understand. You're going to certainly want to talk about your principles and policies, go back to them. They are your go-to information that you're going to really need to look at. Again, steady Eddie, that's the expectation for us as financial officers. We are expected to be still very much transparent in the way that we're going to administer policy, whether it's a crisis or not. So we want to look at those foundational principles like financial sustainability, again, and transparency and open and honesty, and make sure that we incorporate that into that message in terms of our strategy. We're going to want to understand in terms of the crisis our financial position. So again, I would suggest for anybody developing your message now, you're going to want to take a really good look at your reserves, your unrestricted surplus, the opportunities you have from a debt perspective. We want to understand what's our financial position as a municipality. Can we ride this storm? And if we can't, what are we going to do about that? So, and again, I'm hearing things like increased debt capacity is happening in a lot of municipalities. I'm hearing things about budget deficit for the first time I've ever heard of in my time as a municipal officer. We really have to understand how is the financial position we have currently going to be positioning us in terms of our messaging. We have to get that out. Are we ready? Or aren't we ready from a financial perspective? We have to get that message out very quickly to ultimately our council and our executive. Again, we have to understand unique stakeholders. I've already talked about this, so I won't go into this in any depth. We have to figure out what our message vehicle is going to be. So part of your strategy, how is it we're going to actually get our message out? We want to develop it early and we want to use it consistently. So again, is it going to be our website? Do we use social media? Do we use media releases? Do we use the news media within our municipality? How is it we're going to get our message out? Pick one or two that are key and make sure you stick to it. Because one of the things that frustrates people very much is, I didn't get the message. I didn't know that's where I was supposed to go. So one of the key parts of your messaging strategy in any types of crisis is choosing how you're going to get the message out to the public and to council very quickly, and make sure you stick to it so that you're consistent and people know where to go to get their information. You want to determine your timing needs. Like I said, you're going to want to have your regular updates and then spontaneous need. Basically, again, crisis, we're going to have to pivot and react quickly to changes as they happen from a financial perspective. Again, I'll be honest with you, a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago, I never would have guessed that we'd be looking at opening up our business community again this quickly. Now it's happening. And so we have to start thinking about the pivoting that's going to happen from a messaging perspective. How's it going to affect us financially as municipalities? So we want to be ready for spontaneous messaging, but we also want to make sure the council's aware we're part of the leadership team from a regular update perspective. You want to anticipate, and you certainly want to be proactive, and it's just anticipating what kind of messaging is going to be needed out there. We want to be accurate, obviously, so make sure you take the time and pause. Part of your strategy, you're going to have to tell your executive, you're going to have to talk to your council and say, look, if we're going to be really good from a messaging strategy perspective for financial officers, we still need to have a bit of time. We cannot react, say, overnight to figure out the whole impact that this is going to have on our municipality in the long term. It's just not realistic. And so we need to buy ourselves time, and we want to make sure that we have a correct message. An incorrect message is worse than no message at all. I can't stress that enough. So you want to make sure that part of your strategy is being accurate and buying time to get your message correct. You're going to want to look at that financial impact messaging. As I talked about before, you're going to want to understand your financial position. You're also going to want to understand the financial impact. And so this is where it becomes critical from a leadership perspective. You need to interpret the crisis in financial terms and update information as needed for correctness and change. Crisis is not static. And so you're going to want to, again, you're going to understand that financial position, but you also need to understand your analytics is going to have to be able to analyze things quickly. What if we close the recreation facilities? What if we reopen them? What if we reopen and need transit because businesses open again? What's going to happen if we have a deferral of 4 months for our taxation revenue? How is it we're going to be impacted as the municipality? We want to make sure our messaging is involved in our strategy, and we want to basically tie that to our timing needs, spontaneous versus regular updates, and we want to be realistic in terms of what we can do. You want to tie the message to the crisis stage. I'll go back to the crisis message stages that I provide you. There's 6 of them. You want to make sure that whatever message you have is tied to the right timing and stage. So for example, you may not want to get to, say, the solution stage when you're still looking at the assessment of what the crisis is. You want to make sure that you're accurate and timely with your messaging, but you want to make sure that you're also cognizant, again, of the timing. And I can't stress enough, we've seen some leaders out there talk about the solution and things are getting better, and before we even had the information and know that things truly were, and that caused a lot of issues, again, from a media perspective, from a again, people stress perspective, in terms of getting mixed messages about where we were in terms of the pandemic. Your solution messaging is really important. You want to be careful about this. You want to make sure that your recommendations are part of the overall corporate crisis solution message, but they must be accurate. Again, delay the message if it's not ready, but understand a big part of your finance strategy is going to be how do we develop the solution messaging and how do we do it in an empathetic way. Again, I can guarantee you in some way, shape, or form, part of our messaging is going to be how do we overcome the financial deficits that we're going to incur from the pandemic over, say, the next 5 to 10 years. How are we going to overcome that as municipalities? You want to control your message, make sure that you're proactive and you anticipate messaging challenges. Again, as Wayne alluded to, use your professionals, get really good in terms of like how you write your message, make sure that you're using the right medium. And again, be careful of the extremely negative impacts you can have from your messaging if you do not send it out accurately in a timely fashion. And again, it's empathetic to people's needs and or situation. And then finally, one of the most important parts of your message strategy is you go through this list and you start developing your strategies. You want to make sure that you have an opportunity for message review. Make sure you have a second set of eyes or colleagues that can review your message, and make sure somebody has, again, an opportunity to pause and look at it. Again, whenever I did this kind of work, we would typically have where I would present, even a council meeting, I would present some of the information I was going to present to my staff. I would go through my presentation and they would point out things. Well, you said this, was that right? Or this could cause some issue as you're presenting to council, or this could cause a public issue. Make sure when you're putting your messaging together, you have at least one other person look at it, maybe your communication specialist, and probably people that are actually peers, people within finance that can take a look at your message and make sure, one, it's accurate, and make sure it's really tying and really looking at the stakeholders that your messages are going to be tied to. So that really is, again, the 12 steps for really the message strategy that you're going to want to employ. I can't stress enough, really go through this, because again, this has really helped me in the past. Whenever I was faced with a crisis, my observation is ones who use steps like this really were far more successful than people who just did the work off the cuff. Now, the cash flow model, as I said, we're right bang on time for the hour, so we're not going to have a lot of time to go through this. I will provide a supplemental on this and the template, but really it's going to, the what if model that I built for a client will help you determine the impacts to service changes. It will look at your revenue, the permanent challenges that we may have, and again, the delayed revenue impacts. So we're going to have permanent change and we're going to have non-permanent issues. And we're going to also be looking at our staffing impacts, possible layoffs. And so I developed a model that I'm going to share freely. I'm going to develop about a half-hour presentation on this and present that to you by tomorrow morning. So you'll get a link and have that information for you by tomorrow. So with that, we got through a ton of information. I'm going to stop and ask if you have any questions, and ask Wayne, do you have any comments to wrap things up, Wayne?
Just one, Tim, and I think it really hasn't been mentioned, but I think it's really important. We all hope that this will be over soon and life will be back to normal. But what if it's not? And I think that our finance people and our CAOs need to be planning now for a plan B should this pandemic go far longer than a few months. Or, as I feel is quite possible, if we see another wave and we may need to confine ourselves at home again and more businesses will close. A key part of this plan will be the communication aspect, but finance is key. So what I'm saying is assume the best, but prepare for the worst.
It's a great comment. And I think as finance officers, we have to understand conservatism is a key part of our leadership attributes. And we're going to be looking at this and saying this is going to take us years to recover in some way, shape, or form. That situational issue is going to result in significant revenue challenges, service deficits, whatever it might be. We need to be prepared for that. So with that, I'm going to ask, and again, Anne or Lee can paraphrase if there's any questions. I'm going to leave you with one thing that I thought I've done this for my students in Alberta and they appreciated it. Remembering better times. We will be once again back together again. This is me presenting in many of my classes here in Alberta. It's important to understand that we will be back to normal eventually. And again, getting into that optimism thought, this will end, as Wayne said. But we need to be prepared and we need to be healthy and we need to be resilient. And I can't stress enough, you as financial officers, your leadership is really critical during this time. So with that, hopefully you enjoyed the webinar, and I'll open it up to any questions. Anne, Lee, is there anything that I need to answer? Camera on. Okay, I'm not hearing anything from Lee or Ann.
I was muted.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah. Tim,
Sorry.
Wayne, I wanted to thank you both. That was fantastic. I was particularly struck by the need to analyze and assess in a very deliberate, professional manner, keeping in mind the professionalism that was shown before any sort of a crisis into a crisis situation, the need to develop evidence-based decision-making to create those scenarios. As Wayne was saying, this may not be the only wave of the COVID-19 pandemic, and indeed may not be the only crisis that we face this year. I think to the four folks in Fort McMurray in Alberta, and finally to lead finance-related communications to take ownership for those. So thank you again. As folks perhaps are aware, this is a weekly effort that the Canadian Association of Government Financial Officers is providing. As we promised, we will have this posted to our website probably within the next 24 hours with Ann's assistance. Thank you, Ann. But if folks do have questions, I'm happy to if Tim and Wayne, if you can spare a few minutes, we'll certainly take them.
Yep, absolutely. I've got lots of time, so if there's any questions, feel free to paraphrase. Well, one of the things, again, while we're waiting, I just want to say thank you to Lee and Ann and the Canadian Association of Government Financial Officers. Such an important association. I've been part of it for a long time, went to many of its conferences, and this is really about bringing us all together, sharing information. And so I just want to say I really appreciate the opportunity, and hopefully we can do more to help.
Thanks, Tim. I don't see a lot of questions in the question tab, a lot of comments about it being a great webinar. So thank you for that, both you and Wayne. And one funny political comment about your preference for news networks based on your Trump comment. I could read it, but I won't.
I was trying to be really careful, but
yeah.
Thanks. I really enjoyed it. And again, everybody out there, thank you. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact me at any time. We're really here to help. So
thank you, Tim. Thanks, Wayne.
Yeah, anytime. Thanks. Bye, everybody. And thanks again, Wayne. Really appreciate your time. Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care, everyone. Stay safe.